What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Book Binge, where this week we are back to talking about my tier list for 2022, where I rank all of the books that I read over the course of 2022. Like I said, this is part 4, where I am doing another entry. This is going to be a total of 5 videos. The next one will be coming out next week, where I'll finally be getting through the rest of the list. If you've been sticking around for all of these videos, I greatly appreciate it. I've been having fun talking about all these books slightly more in depth. I'll just go ahead and reiterate one last time at the very beginning of this video what the rule is for the tier list, that being, or at least the notice, I guess. What I've been calling it a rule all this time. It's not like it really matters. I'm doing all of this off at the top of my head. None of this is pre-planned or pre-prepped. I don't have like a list of how I'm going to rank the books on in front of me when I'm doing the tier list. It's all just how I feel in the moment when I'm talking about that book. So some of the, some of the placings of some of these books are going to seem weird to some people who are fans of some of these books. And in fact, a couple of them have seemed weird to me because, like, in part 2, I actually fixed something that I ranked in part 1 that seemed a little off to me. So that is something that I just wanted to make you aware of. Without further ado, let me go ahead and switch on over so that we can talk about a few more books, shall we? Alrighty, let's go ahead and start this thing off with Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. Now, at this point, Empire of Silence I actually think of slightly less fondly than most of the rest of the series that I've read thus far, because Sun Eater is incredible overall, with Empire of Silence being, one of the weakest parts of the entire series, even though it is the very beginning of the series, and that is only because of a couple slightly weird pacing issues in parts of the book, particularly within the first half. But in terms of anything that there is bad to say about Empire of Silence, there is not very much bad to say about this book. Rocchio, especially for this being a debut novel, like, this is Rocchio's first book, and it's this good, even with a couple slightly weird pacing things in parts of the book. Like, the fact that this is a debut novel makes me scared for when I eventually try to publish anything that I've written, because holy cow, if I wrote anything this good, I don't know what I would be, but Rocchio is an incredible writer, and this book greatly well exemplifies that immediately. So it is not the best entry of Sun Eater at all, because it's the only one that has anything that I can quote-unquote complain about, or one of the only things that has anything that I can complain about, but it is very, 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 very good. Like, it is worth reading specifically so that you can get to later entries that are super, 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 super good. So I'm going to go ahead and rank this tentatively, I guess, at the very bottom of pretty dang good. And yes, a lot of people will notice that that means it is above Dune. I personally enjoy Empire of Silence more than Dune. Dune has a little bit more to sink your teeth into, admittedly, yes. But I think Empire of Silence, in terms of enjoyment levels, has slightly more to like than Dune does. And a lot of other people are going to be like, well, it's just the Dune ripoff. But no, Rocchio wears some of his influences on his sleeves, especially at the beginning of this book. There are a lot of things where, if you're familiar with Dune, you're going to accept some of the decisions that Rocchio has made with certain things in this series as well. But, like, some of those things are just general. Like, certain elements similar to that, as well as like world building and universe building stuff, is similar to Dune in Sun Eater. But Empire of Silence, Rocchio uses those things and wears his influences on his sleeve, but uses it to build a universe wholly his own in a way that I honestly think is better than Dune. Because, like, Dune's universe building, you see a couple planets, you get one planet for a very long time, you get another planet for a little bit of time, then you get a couple other random locations that don't really mean a whole lot to you, at least as somebody who's only read the first book of the Dune saga. Sun Eater, even in the first book, Sun Eater only has a couple planets that the first book takes place on. However, it feels that the universe just feels a lot more well lived in. It feels a lot more well built. There's reference to tons of other places in the universe, even in the first book, even if they're not actually seen, and especially throughout the rest of the series, he does this as well, which I'll get into a little bit. But Dune, at least in the first book, didn't feel quite as well built out as that. Like, for whatever reason, I just liked the universe building of Empire of Silence better, so that's where I will justify that decision. But because we're still talking about Sun Eater, let's actually just move into The Lesser Devil by Christopher Rocchio, which is a novella that takes place actually pretty much right in the middle of Empire of Silence. I can't remember if it's chapter 22. It's somewhere in that area of Empire of Silence where if you stop at that specific chapter, you could read The Lesser Devil and then start Empire of Silence in between, and that would technically be the chronological order. Empire of Silence was one that I enjoyed a lot. I know there are some people who don't love the novellas or short stories, at least not nearly as much, or not nearly as much as they enjoy the main series of Sun Eater, and that is perfectly fine, but I thought The Lesser Devil was incredible. You got to see some characters and even some locations, even on a familiar planet, that just felt super cool, and Rocchio explores some interpersonal relationships and interactions and conflicts, I guess, with particular cultures and ideas in a way that he did not with Empire of Silence, and to an extent, mostly has not even throughout the rest of the series that I greatly appreciate this novella for. And it was really, really, really good. It was short and concise, told its story, and then it was done. Nothing necessary to understand the main series, but one that I greatly enjoyed. This is going to go above Empire of Silence, but the question is how many more of these other books it's going to go above. That looks good. Between Andromeda Strain and Another Kingdom, because it's far less popcorny than Another Kingdom, because Another Kingdom is really just a popcorn book, all things considered. But The Lesser Devil is a little bit better than that. So let's move on to Throne of Fire, Book 2 of the King Chronicles by Rick Riordan. This, similarly to The Nightmare Feast, suffers from middle book syndrome slightly because the climax doesn't mean as much as it could have, since you know that there is a third book after it. However, a lot of the things that do happen in this book are still enjoyable, as, although it also has probably the worst slash most annoying element of the book as well, that being the dreaded YA love triangle problems. There is an element to something similar to that in this book that also appears a little bit in the next book as well, that is, like I said, probably the most annoying book or element of the entire series. This book was not something that I disliked, but it was definitely the one that I disliked the most of the trilogy. I don't think it's as rough around the edges as Sea of Monsters is, because Throne of Fire still plays super well into the full trilogy arc, the things that it builds up to, the things that it has to do in order to allow the Serpent's Shadow to happen. But it definitely has a couple of those elements that are worse than some of the other things. I'm going to go ahead and put this just below Master and Margarita, I guess. Maybe above. I'll leave it above. That sounds good to me. But then we're going to talk a little bit about The Serpent's Shadow, the last book in the trilogy. And this is one I absolutely loved. Like I talked about with The Last Olympian, Riordan just has a very good way of wrapping things up and tying together loose ends that is so splendid that he does incredibly well in this book. This book is super, super well polished in terms of its storytelling. Copy editing, not so much. There are so many copy editing issues in this book that it's like, you have to wonder if the editor even did his job at all, because the second half, particularly of this book, has so many copy editing issues that it's like legitimately distracting to read. However, regardless of that fact, because that's honestly kind of low on the priorities of the story, it needs to be readable, but minor copy editing issues aside, this was incredible. I don't know if it is quite, I want to put it in cream of the crop, despite the copy editing issues, which are severely distracting and that I'm still kind of salty about. The story and the way everything wraps up is so good. The question is if I put it above or below The Last Olympian, because that's really the question. Um, I'm probably going to regret this in about 2.5 seconds, but I'm going to put The Serpent's Shadow just above The Last Olympian just because it wraps up the entire trilogy brilliantly, whereas The Last Olympian actually leaves stuff open just enough to allow for another series to occur, which is why The Heroes of Olympus exists. And I love The Heroes of Olympus as a series as well, even better than King Chronicles or Percy Jackson. So I kind of just have to say that The Last Olympian being slightly more open is the only justification that I can give for it being below The Serpent's Shadow. Because story-wise, I enjoy The Serpent's Shadow just so much. And that's, yeah, that's where I'm going to leave that. So next book on this list is a little bit different, that being the oldest book that I have read up to this point by a significant degree, being The Iliad by Homer. And I read the Peter Green translation, and boy, I'll tell you what, is it a good translation. It is so good. So good. And you could also say that that's because the Iliad in and of itself is so good, but I loved this thing a ton, and I was shocked by how much I loved it. Even though it does have the problem that it is not really a story in the way that most stories nowadays are considered stories, at least in terms of plot, because a lot of this, it doesn't necessarily have an overarching arc that it is trying to, that it introduces and then resolves later. Like, it kind of does, but only within like a very particular character. Most everything else about this doesn't really have that. I guess part of that could be ostensibly because the Iliad is a history of the peoples and was performed as such, like a song. And that is why there's repetition throughout certain moments of it. However, the Iliad just surprised me so much, and it was just such a good read. Like, I finished it, and even though it might not be my favorite thing that I've ever read in the world, it was probably the easiest thing that I've ever rated 5 stars. Even, like, despite as much as I absolutely loved everything about the Dark Tower and the Iliad, I have a couple, like, minor issues with, technically, comparatively. But the Iliad, as a package, was one of the easiest things for me to rate 5 stars, because it was just so, so brilliant as a work of art, quite frankly. It was very, very good and very enjoyable. Next, we're going to talk about Howling Dark, Book 2 of The Sun Eater. And if you thought Empire of Silence was good, boy howdy hey, can't wait for you to read Howling Dark. This book probably gave me about 3 independent aneurysms on its own. It was kind of crazy, and the climax, insane. This book is so hard to talk about with going into spoilers, because it is like, so much happens in this book. It is, what, 600 and something pages, 640 pages or so, and not a single one of those pages, nary a paragraph, is wasted at all in this entire package, and it is brilliant. It is incredible. Like, the fact that I read both Howling Dark and the Iliad in September made my picking the book of the month for that month was pretty much impossible, because I felt like neither one of them was quote-unquote better than the other. I feel like I'm going to give the edge to the Iliad, though, in terms of this ranking, just because it was so... it surprised me so much. I was expecting to enjoy Howling Dark because I enjoyed Empire of Silence, and I was expecting for there to be elements of it that blew me away because of the way that people talked about it. The Iliad was one that I was like, okay, well, there's a chance that I actually don't like this, just because of the fact that it's so old and so unconventional. But I will give the nod to Homer in this one, and that is a decision that even Christopher Rocchio himself is okay with. He told me when I said that for my book of the month in September, I was just like, it was so close, it was unfair to Howling Dark, but I have to give it to the Iliad, and he was like, I'm okay with taking second place to Homer. So that is what has happened here. So that is pretty much where that has been left off. The next book we're going to talk about here is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, and this is one that, like, you're either going to love it or you hate it. I've talked about this on several occasions, both in my reading wrap-up and TBR for September, because I had started reading it at the end of September, so I talked about it a little bit in that, and my October reading wrap-up and TBR, because I finished it in October and got to talk more about it in my spooky season reading wrap-up that I did. I think that came out in December, maybe November, I don't remember. I think that came out in November, actually, where I talked about it a little bit. And then in an independent review that I did that I believe came out in December, where I talked about it even more. Like, I've talked about American Psycho to death, so I don't need to talk about it a whole lot even more. It is just one that I jived with so well. I cannot believe I loved it as much as I did. I only rated it 4 stars on Goodreads because, for whatever reason, I feel like like, personally, I just don't know why I can't give it 5 stars, but I can't give it 5 stars, but I loved it. It is a personal favorite, even despite that, just because I jived with it so hard. So it doesn't go in cream of the crop because it's not on that level. But in terms of just sheer enjoyment, I think this goes at the top of pretty dang good because I loved it so much, and that came as such a surprise to me when I read it that, like, I feel like that's a good place to put it. So yeah. Next, let's talk about Queen of Mid-Ashes by Christopher Rocchio, which is another novella in the Sun Eater universe. This one I read in between Howling Dark and Demon in White. I really enjoyed Queen of Mid-Ashes as well. However, I think it might be my personal least favorite entry in the Sun Eater period. Anything that I've read from the Sun Eater, this one might be my least favorite. I don't know why. Most people who have read this absolutely adore it, think it is one of the best things he's written, and it does admittedly have one of the best closing lines of anything I've ever read, especially anything by Christopher Rocchio himself. But for whatever reason, I don't know why, if it was like I was in a bad mood for it when I started it, because I had just read American Psycho, which was a little bit different, and a few other things before that that were a little bit different. So I don't know why for sure. I didn't jive with the pacing of this one per se, but there were some pacing issues for this one that I felt like it either should have been a really concise half novella, like it could have been like half the length and been a fantastic, amazing short story, or it could have been like 5 to 10 chapters longer and been an even better, more fully fleshed out novella. The length that it is at just feels simultaneously too short and too long to me, and that is primarily the reason why I say that this is my least favorite Sun Eater entry. As such, I'm going to put it below Dune, um, because it is rough around the edges to me, in my opinion. But quite frankly, the worst Sun Eater entry is still better than plenty of other things that I read this year. Cough, cough, cough. Obscene Bird of Night. But Queen of Mid-Ashes is still very good and very much worth your time, and especially since I think I'm definitely in the minority of not absolutely loving Queen of Mid-Ashes to pieces. Not to mention that the title is pretty dope. So, if you're into Sun Eater, do not skip Queen of Mid-Ashes. Like I said, I'm in the minority of not liking it quite as much. So, with that all being said, this is probably the shortest of the tier list videos up to this point, but I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there. I've recorded all 4 of these videos back to back to back up to this point, and I'm not going to be recording part 5 for a couple days when I will have actually finally finished the final thing that I read over the course of the month. Sorry, these two are in the wrong order. I'm finishing up my final book that I'm reading over the course of the year that I should be able to be finished with on Saturday morning at the time that I'm recording. By the time I'm recording this, like I said, and that is when I'll record part 5 of this tier list. And I'm going to go ahead and come back to here. There we go. That has been fun so far, recording these 4 tier lists. I hope you enjoyed this one as well. I hope I haven't enraged too many people over the course of these videos, although I'm sure that I have. But thank you guys all for sticking around through all of them so far. Be sure to come again next Thursday when I'll be doing the final part of this tier list. It'll be here soon enough. I'm very excited to see where all of the rest of these entries end up and to see what the final tier list looks like so that I can share it around. So that'll be fun. But like I said, thank you guys for watching. I don't have anything more to say. I'll be back again on Monday with a special video that isn't a book review, but is still book related, obviously, because this is the Book Binge after all. But I'll be back next Thursday with the final part of this tier list. I'll talk to you guys then.